descended to the tropical veldt and grassland. We migrated across the deserts of the Near and Middle East, which were not so desertous at that time, but we also were able to cross the Himalayas. We exist in the Arctic, in the rainforest. We exist at the level of the Witoto or the modern New Yorker. We are adaptable. And this is what has kept our options open. And this is what I think we have to recognize and conserve. And the psychedelics do that. The psychedelics are, to my mind, although people have actually argued this with me, although it seemed really incontrovertible to me, that they are deconditioning agents, that they make you question. What Marxist, Mormon, whatever you are, if you take psychedelics, you will ask questions that cannot be answered within the paradigm in which you were brought up. And that's important because all of these social systems are only means to the next level of ascent. What we see in the Soviet Union today is a hang-up. They have an ideology which allows no means to the next level of ascent. They are caught forever in the Hegelian dialectic. There's no escape. It's hopeless. And so they have occupied an evolutionary niche very successfully. But now what are they going to do? And every society is confronted with this because every society erects institutions which try to freeze the historical process. It's almost as though we are continuously calcifying, and yet we must not let that happen. I think it was Ludwig von Bertalanffy who said human beings are not machines, but in every situation, given their own will, they will behave like machines, fall into routines, and just cease to examine what is in front of them. So I think that the psychedelic thing is very important. I'm sorry to see it, it's clouded, it's a murky picture. I don't see, I think people should do more of it and reflect, and that there should be much less missionary work. That the goal is not to get as many people stoned as possible. The goal is to make sure that everybody who gets stoned gets really stoned, so that we don't have a bunch of confusion about just exactly what we're talking about.
No nibblers.
I mean, I meet people who the only drug they have ever taken is MDMA. And we're trying to have a conversation about the nature of the psychedelic cosmology. It's weird sledding, you know. Okay, cybernetics, psychedelics, space is the other one. And I see all of these things as just completely one thing. And as I said this morning, I think the difference between Jose and I, one difference is that he is interested in creating a planetary consciousness out of the surrender of the ego of individuals to this higher vision of what should happen. I think that there already is this superhuman organism, and that our freedom is largely illusory. We are all moving to the tune of what Freud called the superego, what I call the overmind, because I don't like the notion of superego is a little torchlight parades and that sort of thing. But the overmind, the notion of simply a control mechanism, which is almost cybernetic, but which is leading everything forward and actually is orchestrating what is happening, so that all of these human groups which aspire to hegemony, you know, Wall Street, the Communist Party, the Zionists, you name it, they are all frustrated because there seems to be an invisible impeding force against their machinations and their vision of how things should be. And no matter how many guns they pile up, no matter how much propaganda they churn out, the historical continuum has a way of stabbing them in the back and surprising them endlessly. This is, I think, because they are fools playing with a master, which is the superego. And until this, and what we as individuals can do is help that process by not participating in the projections of anxiety that these various factions are pushing, that arise out of their frustration with their inability to get a handle on things. I don't want them to run things, Wall Street or the Communist Party or anybody. I think that it works very nicely that it is run invisibly from the unconscious. I think it was Charles Fort who said, there comes steam engine time, and then there will be steam engines. And that is what is happening with modern technology, even to the point of the atomic bomb. I am willing to explore the notion that the atomic bomb has been a wonderful force for cohering people's minds around the question of planetary survival. That if we had come out of World War II with aerial bombing and mustard gas and but nothing quite horrifying enough to shock people awake, I think it's remarkable that we have lived in such a stable world since 1945, that it has never, only once was it used against a human population. And my God, think of the hatred and the loathing that is loose on this planet. And yet the bomb has sobered people. And every political movement for social cohesion and enlightenment that is post-1945 has built its rhetoric around the bomb. The peace movement, to some degree, the hippies, the existential response of the Beat generation, all of these rich cultural phenomena have been reflections on the bomb. So the bomb is good. The thing that is important is not to use it. Then it becomes a problem. I think that this thing that has broken about nuclear winter is very interesting. Capitalism is very interested in making money. A decimated Earth is not good real estate. And I think that the nuclear winter issue is the beginning of the end of the nuclear logjam. That because the Soviet Academy of Sciences conducted an independent study, they reached the same conclusion. The people who were skeptical of Sagan and the others, they researched it, they reached the same conclusion. War is obsolete. And this is actually understood by the people who frighten us the most. I really think that they have come to see it as a bad deal and no money maker. And in that case, there will be change. The novelty wave is affecting all of these institutions. The strategies are changing at the very topmost level because it's no good to have a no-win situation. So, and as far as the space travel thing is concerned, I really think that inner and outer space are the same thing, and that we will come to understand this through research on psychedelics, that when the ayahuasquero in the Peruvian Amazon tells you he goes to the Milky Way, he is not really kidding. You see, no matter how radical we are in our assumptions, it's very hard to not assume that we don't at least have 95% of the picture. I mean, for instance, we believe in things like elementary particles and these things may be no closer to the mark than the notion that the world was created when the ant king got out of his canoe at the second waterfall to take a leak. You know? These may be preposterous notions. The polite approach that is usually taken is to say, well, everybody has a bit of the piece. The Mayans had a bit of the piece. The Buddhists, they know something. Those Sufis, they're pretty sharp. The mushrooms suggested that nobody has a piece of the action. That it's all wrong. It's all completely 100% bullshit. You see? And that's a very cleansing notion. to begin to explore, to return to ground zero and start out with how radical a deconstruction can we carry on with this world? What is the real nature of language? This is what all of these fine theories leave out. It's what mine leaves out. It's what Jose's leaves out. It's that, what is this phenomenon called language, where by making little mouth noises, we coax roughly congruent notions into each other's brains and then gabble joyfully over this achievement, Reality is not made of electrons or quarks or any of these things. It is clearly made of language. And all of these abstractions, the faceless myths that were mentioned this morning, are totally naive about language. They just view it like a fish views water. It's good to speak clearly, that's important. But other than that, they haven't a word to say about the epistemic basis of language. Science is most guilty of this because science is a very old institution. Consequently, its most fundamental assumptions were carried out in the atmosphere of greatest epistemological naivete. Things like that the universe is knowable at all. Things like that induction is a good way to think. Induction is when you say, well, if it happened 10 times, it'll probably happen the 11th time. Probably. There's a loaded word that science is very big on. So the real revolution is to come, I think, in language. And the way in which psychedelics and feminism and cybernetics all come together is that we each need to carry out a very basic analysis of what we think about language and what we think it is and what we think it does. For instance, I've noticed, and this may be because I'm male, but I've noticed that there are all these things flying around which can't be discussed. And I finally realized that they're emotions is what they are. And that we have a very, very limited vocabulary of emotions. We experience an amazingly rich interior gradient of shifting modalities of which we never can say, you say, I like you, I don't like you, I'm uncomfortable, I really feel weird. This is just like, petroglyphs about emotion. Ralph Metzner and I have been playing with the idea that there is and certainly Robert Graves and other people have preceded us in this, but that there is hardwired into the human brain a kind of language that is older than agreed upon dictionaries, that is, in fact, to hear it is to understand it. The problem is the only thing it can convey are emotions. But the emotions that it can convey are so finely graded and so rich in their adumbrations and resonances that it's like a form of magic. And we call this glossolalia and classify it as a subpsychotic or near-psychotic phenomenon, brain origin uncertain, cultural use uncertain, so forth and so on. Ralph and I have even toyed with the notion of holding weekends where we would insist that every rationally apprehendable utterance be followed by an utterance which was not rationally apprehendable. The non-rationally apprehendable utterance would anchor you in the emotional gestalt of the moment, and that would be like the carrier wave, which... Do it? I thought you'd never ask. Estidi me hiedig wa waktige bidiging et fed mi zedgel jegwa kwam bedige veektan me. Didige me heng bekwak dichtin, a tigis vipit, kepek nidige bi ikt kebi dichtin.
I've had a conversation like this with someone in Sudan, and it was amazing to me because there was a flood festival there who couldn't translate it.
What is being conveyed once you get used to it is the anchoring and the gestaltung of the emotional moment.
And this man was reading my emotions to a finer level than what he was translating. Then, I mean, I recognized that what he was saying, but it was accurate, not a mood.
That's right.
Amazing.
You discover these things on psychedelics, but they are clearly subject to creodization, in other words, to being learned, that you can lay down these pathways in the brain, and it's marvelous.
But I think this is fundamental to language learning anyway, because this is how the child learns, and how you learn when you're in a foreign country and you don't study from a book. You understand long before you can speak.
That's right.
And you don't know what's being said,
That's
but yet
right.
you do come to understand.
You can pick it up.
And the child is always spoken to in terms which are way above anything of its verbal comprehension, but it understands it well.
So we need to learn to be able to create these linguistic constructs which are not meaning-tied, but which communicate. One of the most interesting things about psilocybin is that on high doses, this asynesthesia takes place, where when you articulate in this emotional glossolalia, you actually can condense objects which are beheld. In other words, you take control of the mechanism of the hallucinations, and you create these toy-like, jewel-like, self-transforming grammatical complexes. You are speaking some kind of translinguistic language which is beheld rather than heard. And Philo Judaeus talked about the more perfect logos, and he said the more perfect logos will be beheld rather than heard, but it will pass from being heard to being beheld without ever crossing over a discernible barrier of transition. And I have experienced this, and I think other people have, where you hear the glossolalia like wave, and it comes closer and closer, and then at a certain point it is manifest as a topology. And I think many of the psychedelics communicate in these visual languages. After taking ayahuasca, and sitting with these people in darkened huts in the Amazon, after hours and hours of it, your eyes are just bugging out of your head. You just have spent hours looking and looking and looking and drinking in this visual data. And this is how really dense information is conveyed, not a linear string of little mouth noises where the brain rushes to the conventionalized dictionary and then grimly reconstructs the intention, provided nothing too finely sculpted was intended. And I think, what's happening with the monitoring of brain states. Ralph Abraham, who was here this morning, is the director of the Visual Mathematics Project at Santa Cruz. Glossolalia, language, drugs, cybernetics, all of these things are the means to transforming the human self-image. It's almost impossible to imagine what a society would be like where this glossolalia held sway equal with speech. I think the pre-Celtic people, the Celts of Ireland, may have been into this because they rarely spoke without punning, and you were expected to pun on multiple levels. And the pun, far from being trivial, is a step toward this hyperdimensional linguistic construct. It's almost like a fractal. A pun is a word with 1.5 dimensions or more in it. And it resonates. This this vision that I conveyed this morning of the co-presence of resonant epochs in time could only be conveyed if someone could transform their language in such a way that it was implicit that this was happening, and we were all noticing it and experiencing it the way we are noticing and experiencing the greenness of this tree, the fall of the sunlight through the leaves. We could also be experiencing the ebb and flow of Mesopotamian empires and Hellenistic religions and so forth and so on. The fourth quadrant of the mandala, and then I will open it up for questions, of which I hope there are many, is feminism. And I feel very trepidatious wading into this. But nevertheless, I really feel in some ways it is the most important of all of these, because it is going to work the change that is going to go on between us as individuals. What is happening, I think, is nothing less than an awareness that the most appropriate way to talk about the entelechy of this planet is to call it her, and to admit that the goddess worship, which was repressed by the rise of the patriarchal religions, is now its return is necessary. I don't want to say that the patriarchal interlude, which lasted to 3,000 years, was not necessary. I think it was necessary. But the fear will go out of the bomb when the hand that rocks the cradle holds the bomb, essentially. And all the bad little boys of the 19th and the 20th century who have been fiddling with their chemistry sets now need to recognize that this all has to be handed over to cooler heads who have not been scarred by the historical experience in the way that I think masculine intelligence has been. And psychedelics I count as a feminizing force because they introduce you to the unconscious. Cybernetics I count as a feminizing force because it hardwires that same unconsciousness and raises it into inaccessibility. No longer are these things the theoretical constructs of psychologists. They become, living realities in our lives. And the transformation of the species into a spacefaring, whether interior, exterior, or something else kind of space, is only going to happen if this feminizing influence can now take the heat off the technological processes which were necessary to move us here. And feminism really, it has nothing to do with gender. It's just an attitude toward being in the world that is open, I think, basically to the translinguistic. If you had to strip it of all biological notions of what feminism is a kind of mentality which operates exterior to language. And it's like the Nagual and the Tonal. There's no unifying those two things or encompassing one with the other. It just is not like that. These things are alchemical opposites. And as such, the only way they can be unified is in a kind of coincidentia oppositorum, a union of opposites where the identity of each element is still fully expressed. This is not a rational concept. It's like being in two places at one time. Nevertheless, it is a concept that is psychologically and experientially very, very valuable. And I see, as I say, all of these forms of self-exploration and technological expansion and even space. I mean, if the Earth is our mother, then certainly outer space is our dark blue great-grandmother. So I sort of give this as a background on what was said this morning because I wanted to convey the one thing I have to convey which is uniquely mine, which is this strange wave. And that's mine, but it's difficult to understand, and its importance is open to debate. It may be trivial in the extreme. This afternoon, I sort of wanted to speak as a member of the culture who is trying to figure it out like everybody else, using the same data banks that everybody else is using. And it was in Hawaii that I thought about this a lot, and I think these are the 4 pillars, or the 4 quadrants of the mandala that lead in to the coincidentia oppositorum, which is the flying saucer, the exteriorized soul of the human race at the end of time, the transcendent object that will carry us all completely out of these concerns and into an entirely different set of concerns of which we have not the faintest inkling. So are there questions or debate? In the back, Dawn. Oh yes, there's a wonderful story, a Gordon Wasson story, where he took I think 12 grams, or anyway, a lot in Oaxaca up on a mountain, and he sang all night long, and just this exultant, ecstatic singing. And when he came down to the village the next morning, the people said, "We didn't know you spoke Mazatecan. You sing beautifully." I had an experience which reflects on this, which is in 75, when we first wrote the mushroom book, and we were really doing it a lot because we had a lot of batch testing to do and that kind of thing. It would get into these poetic dialogues where it would just be spieling off its vision of things. But at the end of each of these sentences, it would say, says, blah, 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 says, and again, and I thought, strange speech habit. And then I read in Wasson that the word sin occurs at the end of these speech utterances of Maria Sabina's, and that it is the Mazatec word for says. So it's just like, the mushroom is uncanny. Drugs, models of what drugs do, will not encompass it. That's why the extraterrestrial thing is so compelling. And I don't know whether the mushroom is a radio or the extraterrestrial itself. When I said this morning that if you understand the DNA as a species, you will take control of your form, I always have the notion that the mushroom has done this, and that's why it touches matter so very lightly. I mean, the mushroom is a very thinly spread mycelial network through a field or a meadow somewhere. The carpophore, what we call the mushroom, is an appurtenance to the sexual process. As Ralph Abraham said one time, it's for sex, thrills, and sunbathing. And that's all it's for. The mushroom is perfectly able to propagate itself by vegetatively growing through the soil. But the mushroom, if we believe it is an entity, it lives in its own imagination. It has gotten so rid of a physical form that all it is a little bit of white stuff in the soil and a raging trip in an unknown dimension, which you can only slice into by allowing it to translocate into your nervous system. And then it continues to give off its experience of itself, which is an immersion in pure imagination, For it, the thought is the fact of the matter. It's as though the mushroom were made of pure light. If you think about what it would be like to be made of light, light moves at relativistic speeds. Therefore, if a photon has no perception of time, if a photon could think and thought, I am now going to cross the galaxy, and then did cross the galaxy, the photon's perception of how long that took would be zero. The photon is a particle which in the physics we know has the experience as though it were the imagination. And I think that this inner-outer space that we keep talking about, that we're headed into, is like the inner-outer space of the mushroom. These things can be found to be contiguous and somehow two aspects of the same thing, arising out of a misperception having to do with edges, that we're very interested in the inside and the outside, the surface of my body and the interior of my body, but these inside-outside distinctions are preposterous, obviously. Infinite space is infinite space, and then we're only quibbling about how it's experienced by whether you send a thought or an instrumentated probe obeying Newtonian ballistics.
Have you thought possibly of running a program next to the historical calendrical one you have there of, say, the advent of tea in English society and the advent of coffee in, say, American society, and the relationships, let's say, between Arab societies, which are heavy coffee drinkers, and
you mean to try and track the drug effect?
Yes, because obviously every society is bound together by a network of drugs. I mentioned the other day that the change that's taken place in the United States with the program to stop people from smoking cigarettes, tobacco being a leveler, and then the rise in stress after that, and then the whole industry built upon stress. There's obviously a relationship between the drugs used in a society.
That's right.
And what the society does.
Well, we were talking last night. My brother wants to say, and is in fact publicly lectured to this point, that the missing link in the question of how did humanness emerge so quickly. You know, there was basically a hominoid form, a human-like form 3 million years ago. But really, it's in the last 50,000 years that the human brain size has undergone this immense expansion. The human brain has grown more in the last 50,000 years than in the previous 3 million years. And he wants to suggest that the catalyst for that was actually that when Africa turned drier and people started living on the ground and hunting in packs, they encountered herds of ungulate animals, and they would track them for days. And this tracking of herds of animals brings you through a lot of their manure naturally. And so they would have noticed this very anomalous object in the world of natural objects, which is the mushroom. It's very large, it's very noticeable, and they would have eaten it. And this would have conferred a sufficient adaptive advantage, the expansion of consciousness, that they would have, it would have been sufficient to prime the pump to develop consciousness. I talked to Roland Fisher years ago about some of these ideas. He did experiments, very interesting experiments at NIMH, in which they could they had two parallel metal bars, and they could, by turning a screw, deform one of the bars slightly so they were no longer parallel to each other. And they would take straight people and people who had been given small doses of psilocybin, and they would sit them down in front of this thing, and they would say, push the buzzer when the bars are no longer parallel. And they discovered that people on small doses of psilocybin could pick this up much sooner than normal people. And so Rollins' conclusion, he said, there, you see, here's perfect proof, scientific proof, that taking drugs gives you a truer picture of the world. Well, it's a joke, of course, but if we're talking about hunters hurling spears and trailing after animals, a 5% increase in visual acuity is a staggering adaptive advantage. And that's just one of the most trivial effects of the mushroom, is this improvement of visual acuity. What it does for language is totally unexplored. What it does for memory, what it does for all kinds of things is unexplored. If we, before they were called psychedelics, before they were called all the things, entheogens and all these things, they were simply given a phenomenological description, consciousness expanding drugs. Well, if you take that seriously, consciousness is what it's all about. Consciousness is what we certainly need. It's what we're in short supply of. We are not going to weather the cultural crises that are bearing down on this planet without a great deal of consciousness being generated. So if there is any agent in the environment, drug, teaching, practice, you name it, that actually increases consciousness, it is going to loom very important. In my experience, hallucinogenic drugs are pretty much unique in the power and the efficacy that they bring to the process of promoting consciousness. Yeah, over here, say something. No? Yeah, go ahead. My experience of it is not that it's no sweat, it's the most terrifying thing I do in my life. What makes you question?
Why it's not
Well, right.
generalizing a bit. A lot of times the choices have a green kid. Like street kids don't get many mushrooms. They get more.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I
But I think you have a valid point in that the problem in our society is that we have no shamanic tradition, no schedule of initiation. We don't know whether our kids should take these drugs at 14 or 8 and this is a real problem. I've often, if in a archaic society, it's all laid out for you. The elders understand, they bring you into it, there's ritual, there's initiation. It's amazing that we're all here, some of the things we've been through. I mean, I've made the analogy to a person that a psychedelic drug is like the situation of a person walking along the beach and they come upon a beautiful sailboat and they know nothing about sailing. Well, what are the odds that they will be able to enjoy the thrill of sailing if they have no teacher? And I don't mean I'm loath to buy into the notion that one human being has anything to teach another, except things like close your eyes, be quiet, turn off the music. These are teachings of great importance. Right.
I think that there's a part in there too where we've got hold of the wrong end of the stick. I don't think that consciousness can be expanded. I think it's always at its maximum, and that there are inhibitors around by, let's say, habit, and that these inhibitors can be released by drugs or can be accentuated. Obviously, tobacco is an accentuator of the inhibitor because it levels things out. And there are other drugs which will release the inhibitor so that consciousness seems to be more, but it really isn't. One is just released inhibitors. Does that make any sense?
So yeah, but I want to make sure who gets inhibited.
Yeah, but you see, yeah. Well, now you see, now it's random. You see,
Right.
It's random.
Well, the mushroom is such a special case, you know. It certainly draws your attention to an unusual part of reality if it's there all the time. The fact that it seems to be a communicator is puzzling. I still haven't made up my mind about it. When people ask me how I choose drugs, I started out a radical. Nobody else was talking about drugs. Now I find I'm the anchor dragging the ship because I say it should be a plant, number one. It should have a history of shamanic usage, number two. It should have a similarity to brain chemistry. And I am extremely unenthusiastic about MDMA and all these things. It's a plant with a history of shamanic usage. I always say, if you can get 2 out of the 3, let's go do it. Sure. It's simply that at 4 times the effective dose, it's approaching being toxic. It has, there's this notion called the LD50, which is how much of a drug you have to give to 20 mice to kill 10 of them. In other words, 50% of the sample dies, right? The LD50 for MDMA is too close to the effective dose. Absolutely, absolutely. You see, LSD is the safest drug in terms of physical. We're always speaking here of pure chemicals, not street stuff, because no one has ever figured out the LD50 of LSD. You can take 5,000 times the effective dose, and after 16 hours you just shake your head and walk away from it. Psilocybin, the LD50 is 275 times the effective dose. You have heart failure. You die of an acute coronary thrombosis. This is not to put down MDMA. Most drugs are toxic. Anyway, my point is that these shamanic drugs that are hallowed by millennia of usage are much safer. The other thing about them is that they're the strongest psychedelics that exist. This is the great paradox. The safest drugs are the strongest. All it requires is courage. Courage which I do not have all the time, and in fact quite rarely for the biggies. And that's very interesting. I've said many times, the problem is not with regard to psychedelics, the problem is not to find the answer. The problem is to face the answer. We've got the answer. Sasha doesn't have to do another thing. We've got the answer. The question now is, do you have the guts to do it?